Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition of StateScoop's and EdScoop's Government and Education Technology webinar series, brought to you today by Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. I'm your host, Wyatt Cash, Vice President for StateScoop and EdScoop content, and today we're looking at the topic of workload migration and the best practices for transformation. Joining us today are three veteran education and public sector IT leaders who've tackled some of these issues firsthand and have kindly agreed to share some of the key lessons that they've learned. First, I'm pleased to welcome Doug Foster. Doug is the Deputy CIO at Purdue University. Doug, thanks for joining us today, and welcome to the program.
Thanks, Wyatt. Great to be here.
And also joining us today is John Merriman. John is Vice President at Meadow Software. John, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Wyatt. Good to be here as well.
And joining us as well is Greg Herbold, a familiar guest to our programs. He's Director of U.S. Public Sector Programs for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Greg, always nice to have you with us.
Always a pleasure, Wyatt. Thank you.
Great. So I also want to welcome our audience, including those joining us live today, as well as those who will join us on the archived on-demand edition. And, of course, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Before we begin, I'd like to help our audience just get familiar with our console and how they can participate today. On your viewing console, there are several widgets you can open and adjust in size, including a Q&A chat window, and we invite our listeners to submit your questions to our presenters during the webcast, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can, either after each presentation or towards the end of the program. I also want to let our viewers know you can download a copy of today's entire slide deck by clicking the file in the resource list widget on your console. If you don't see it on your screen, look for it in the folder icon at the bottom of your screen. And you can adjust the size of the viewing screen just by clicking the maximize icon or dragging in the window size. And if you do have any technical difficulties, please click the help widget on your screen. Finally, I just also want to reiterate, we do have an on-demand version of this webcast that will be available beginning March 2nd, and it will be available to our viewers for the next 90 days on StateScoop and EdScoop. So take a look for that, and please feel free to share the links that you got in your registration email with colleagues that might benefit from watching the program. So with that, let's get started. Doug, you've been working on ways to improve how your organization deals with the subject of workload migrations at Purdue University, and I'm interested to have you share a little bit of what you've learned and some of the biggest takeaways.
Great. So at Purdue, I think cloud can mean so many different things. I think one of the pieces for us is to sort of experiment in a number of different configurations, and we have something going in virtually every configuration imaginable. But the thing I want to focus in on today is I'm going to talk about one piece of that puzzle, which is what I refer to as this public shared instance space. And the key points for today's discussion are both about entering this kind of environment and exiting. And I would emphasize that the exit is a key part of the thinking here. So as you look at this 2 by 2, the things that the way I'm framing this up is along one axis you'll see public and private. And so for us, we're looking at both things behind our firewall and out in the public space. And there's different criteria depending on what we're trying to do, why we would want it behind the firewall, et cetera, and I'll get into a little bit of that. The other axis you talk about hosted, which is for me sort of infrastructure for rent or that kind of an idea, all the way up to, from an application perspective, sharing one instance of an application with many people. And all of those quadrants bring completely different discussions with them. The one I'm going to focus on today is the upper right-hand corner, the public shared instance. Let me talk about some of these other pieces and what we're doing there and why it's important to us. So in the bottom left, you see this private hosted, and they're the they're sort of single instance applications behind our firewall, and they would tend to be things that are highly, they have a lot of competitive advantage for us. They're sort of, as I say here, the crown jewels. They're the pieces that really make the difference. They're under continual development, lots of work going on there, so we don't want to put those in a place in a shared instance space for sure, and for the IP, the intellectual property, we don't want those in a public space. And if you look at the other two areas here, private, shared instance, these are things that are just require high levels of integration or have sort of intense connections back to other systems or have sensitive data associated with them. So we would want them behind the firewall, but for us it's fair to put those in a shared instance. If you go up the left side and you look at the public hosted environment, for us that usually relates to unique infrastructure primarily. That would probably be the number one reason where we're not going to host an environment like that. We have no need to run it or support it, and we want to push something up there. The other reason that we put applications in that space is we stage them for getting to this shared instance environment. So if we can minimize customization and connections back to the mothership or back to other applications, maybe they're candidates to be moved into this shared space. We're experimenting in all these places to understand what it all means, but I'm going to focus in this public shared instance discussion. I apologize for all the words on the slides here. There's a lot to talk about in this space. So for us, the one lesson that we've learned is that contract skills are absolutely critical in this space. There's just a lot to think about here. There's a lot of T's and C's in these agreements. And as I talked about earlier, the exit strategy is absolutely critical. So somebody has to be really on top of all of those terms, has to understand what all those things mean, how to cost escalate over time, what are the sort of exit ramps from these contracts, all of those sorts of things. So that's one that I could highlight that one as that's probably one of the most important pieces. For us, because of who we are, we're a public institution, security here can be like a deal breaker on some of these things for us. Sometimes the requirements are just too high for our applications. What we need in the way of security around these applications is unreasonable to put in a public space. So that kills the deal. And sometimes vendors just aren't up to snuff on these things. They don't have all of the certifications and all of the security pieces in place that we need to feel comfortable to do this. Another key learning for us has been this organizational change management. We tend, as IT folks, can tend to sometimes look at this as a technology exercise, and for a large amount of it, it is a lot about picking the right technology platform. But there are many pieces, especially in the public shared instance, that will have direct impact on people on the ground here, our user community. Things like when are application upgrades happening, what are the outage windows, all those sorts of things. And if the user community isn't prepared for that, you can get yourself into quite a bit of trouble, speaking from experience. Performance is another one. We really have to watch carefully that we're not taking our user community backwards, that they don't feel as though this is a lesser product because it's now in this public shared instance. And we also think about, from a performance perspective, how do we ramp up? If we add 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 users to this application, how can we ramp up the infrastructure for performance? Another big consideration for us is integration requirements, and the former slide talked a little bit about if the integration is so tight to applications on premise, it may not even be a good fit. But if it does make that, it does clear that hurdle, there's still integration requirements to be thinking about, and how's that going to happen, and what are the methods we're going to be using, and you get into a little bit of vendor capabilities there, because sometimes they can't integrate the way we would like them to. Data, how are we going to get the data back for things like our business intelligence and analytics platforms, and on exit, how do we get the data back? Those things are critically important. Identity and access is just about authentication. Can we use central authentication with these applications? Those kinds of things. I think the last one here is vendor experience, and we tend to go towards our top shelf vendors in these spaces because they just have more experience. They've done this more often. They've done it at the same scale. And I would suggest that people just talk to other customers before you make a leap like this, because you can find invaluable nuggets in there in people that have gone before. We've done quite a bit of that. So the next piece of this is the way we look at it from a getting in perspective is there are three big buckets here. There's a plan, design, and migrate, and there's lots underneath of this. For the sake of a reasonable slide, it only has 6 buckets, but there's lots of things in each of these phases, but I'll give you the sort of the highlights. The plan piece for us, there's a readiness assessment that we do, and I'll show you that in a second, a little snapshot of it. But that's really the entry point for us. We walk through a fairly detailed questionnaire. It's pretty straightforward, but it gives us a sense, it gives us actual score, a metric to say, do we think it's even worth going on to the business case or not? And we've had a number that would have fallen out of that readiness assessment. So then from there we move right into a business case where we're looking at what's the value, what are the cost hurdles and return on investment thresholds, all those sorts of things. Then we move into the design, and the design piece for us is exactly how this gets deployed, and it gets back to some of those things about integration and all of those sorts of pieces. We even in there talk a little bit about things like change management and all of those components. And this finalized requirements, a lot of times we get pretty far down the road in some of these implementations before we discover a whole pile of requirements that we didn't know existed. So we, in our design phase, we do a lot of these design reviews where we say, this is what this is going to look like, this is what it's going to mean, this is what we think we heard, to make sure that we're all on the same page before we pull the trigger. Then when we get to the migrate box, this test block should be 3 times as large as it is, because it's one of the things that we really drive home is we like to test these environments, because there are just so many little nuances that can bite you, and the only way to really figure them out is to run through lots of different scenarios. So we do as much as a vendor will tolerate, we test. And the last one here is this cutover and acceptance piece. It's not insignificant for us, because we don't want this to be something that IT has done to the customers. We want them to be full partners in this discussion. So we go through a fair, it's not like ticker tape parades or anything, but it's a fairly structured customer acceptance and sign-off on the cutover. And we've had people get cold feet and sort of back out of deals at this point, and we won't go forward without that. So that's a critical piece for us. So when I look at the plan phase, this is just a snapshot. I apologize, it's an eye chart, and it's got many more sections to it. But this is this is the readiness assessment. This is what we use. We sit down with our partners and we go through this. And as you can see, it gives you scores, basically, and we can get a sense of, it talks about what would happen if we lost our data, how sensitive is the data, how reliable is the vendor, all those sorts of questions, and it gives us a score. And we can compare that against other opportunities to say, which of these is the most ripe for this kind of a setting. And we won't go on to the business case if this doesn't hold water. If we don't think we're ready, we don't even move beyond this. So in the design process, it's lots of the standard things that you would think about in almost any design. So we go through business process impact. Do business processes flow across multiple systems and those kinds of things, and what are the implications for users? Data model, the integration pieces we've talked about, all the details of the implementation plan, what are the who's going to do what, and what are all those steps that have to get done. Pretty robust testing plan, as I talked to earlier. Another piece of this is the operational guidelines. There's a component of this sometimes where I would say an attitude is that you're giving this thing away. You're putting it in the cloud. Someone else has got some level of responsibility. They're going to do patching or those kinds of things. So you tend to feel like you've given everything away, and you haven't. So it's really clear guidelines that can help you figure out which pieces am I responsible for and which pieces are the vendor responsible for as we're going to operate this thing. Maybe the most important thing on here, the hardware, software, some of those other components, the most important thing in our design is design with an exit in mind. What happens if the relationship goes sour? What happens if the platform isn't performing? How do we back out of this? We go in with a design thinking we're going to be out in a year or 2 or 3, and what would that look like, and how would we design differently if we thought we were going to have to back out in the short term. We have, in some cases, not done that. That's why it's now on the slides, because we've locked ourselves into some situations for longer than we should have, but we didn't have a good plan for how we were going to exit, and I would suggest that's a critical component for this. So then you get to sort of the migrate step, and this is where the cold feet start happening. But we just test, and test. We're obsessed with the testing piece of it because we tend to find lots of problems in this phase, and I'd rather find them before we're putting users on the system. Ensure the exit strategy is viable. We still want to be looking to this exit strategy and say, have we done anything here to lock ourselves in before we move? Defining the support process. This is another key one, especially for the user community. Who are they calling for support on what issues, and how will that work, and what are the support tiers and structures and all those pieces? That's a critical component, and it will look different than it did in the past, so that it's critical to make sure that the user community's bought into that. This deliberate sign-off we talked about, it's a very, we want to make sure that we've got the sign-off. We want to start thinking about decommissioning the legacy applications. This is a step we often forget, and we just end up growing our portfolio rather than, sort of pruning. Tracking performance, we put together some metrics so that we know, are we getting from this application migration what we thought we would, and we keep pretty rigorous track of those things. Last but not least is ensure that all of the contracts, documents, design documents, all those things are well preserved. You can get a lot of selective amnesia when you're well down the road on this stuff, and we like to make sure we have good, solid documentation so that when those questions come up, we can point to something. That was all that I had. Any questions?
Well, Doug, I really appreciate that. A couple of key points that resonated with me. One, I think, is really thinking with the end in mind with regard to an exit strategy. I have to think becomes a very important part. And then also the point that you made about, really planning for decommissioning your legacy system so that you're not ending up just expanding your portfolio. I take it that in your this process, that this allows you to really think in terms of taking this solution and migrating from one school at a college to another, or maybe from one cloud provider to another. The process seems the same, but are there any additional thoughts about thinking ahead to maybe using multiple cloud providers, and that might mean different paths that you have to plan for? How do you take that into account in your planning?
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about the difference between the multiple school option or different vendors, obviously there's big considerations, differences between those two. When we're dealing with partners outside of the university, there are a lot more contractual things to think about, and a lot more issues with sort of money changing hands and those kinds of things. But the rough template of how we walk through this is the same. There are, I would suggest, different detailed questions when we get into things like even security. We know what some of the security issues would be on the campus across different schools and those kinds of things. We are not as familiar with the vendor landscape. So they would maybe look more rigorous. I think all the steps are there. I think they just might be different levels of rigor around them.
Appreciate that. Well, terrific. Well, thank you for that, and I'd like to now invite John Merriman to kind of join us here. John, you kind of have a different perspective, but still one that's relevant to our conversation. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing from your perspective and what you might suggest our audience take away.
Sure. Thanks, Wyatt. So from our perspective, we're looking at this space from a technology perspective. You know, what we're doing is delivering to market a SAS platform that drives workload migrations. And what we're seeing in the field is a wide array of customer demand that's really spanning everything from a traditional data center or raised floor environment to cloud or hybrid type transition requirements. So what we're doing as a group, it fits into the framework that Doug just presented, especially around the actual migration event, but as characteristics that de-risks and potentially makes the overall effort less organizationally intensive. So we're seeing a lot of churn, a lot of movement into public cloud, a lot of movement out of public cloud, and a continuing force for things like data center consolidation, converged infrastructure, and general use cases that are still driving a lot of transition activity within the field. So just to get into this range of topics, so we'll start with a quick overview of the HP Enterprise and River Meadow partnership, an overview of our architecture, key use cases, and a quick recap of competitive differentiation on how we fit into the overall marketplace. So first off, the HP Enterprise River Meadow partnership. So we have an existing reseller agreement with HP, current SKU listings, allowing HP to basically take our product to market. And then behind that, we basically white label our professional services and support capabilities as required around customer requirements, and also standardized as a part of the HP Enterprise delivery capability. There's a standing subscription allowing HP teams and customers to draw down on existing migrations. This runs throughout this year and basically will help accounts and project teams get up and running with pilot projects and migration projects to really get kick-started. We're also bundling with the SP group and also SLED SMB as part of this discussion. And where we're most relevant today is for customers running VMware or moving to vSphere or vCloud-based solutions, which we see as a very big part of the marketplace with HP. So first off, for definitions, a workload. So our common denominator is an operating system instance. For us, x86, Windows, and Linux operating systems are what we move and what we define as a workload. And that would include the installed applications, binaries, data, application data, user data, et cetera, that is resident or locally mapped to a given operating system instance. We're basically able to move that to supported cloud environments. So technically what we do, if you look at the overall architecture, is move those operating system instances or workloads from any physical, virtual, or cloud source to any supported target. And today we support vSphere, vCloud, and vCloud Air. We are engineering Amazon Web Services this quarter. And for the rest of the year, the roadmap items, the high priority items, and this definitely reflects the market as it's evolving, are Azure and OpenStack. If you have a routable path between the source operating system instance and a supported target cloud environment, we're basically able to migrate or clone and copy that operating system instance live to the target environment without installing software or code in the source environment. So how we do that is interesting. So we're set up as a SaaS platform. Everything that we're doing is network-based, and we're not installing code or appliances or software on the sources. So a lot of the challenges that Doug was describing earlier around change management, organizational support, and testing are somewhat simplified in that we're not affecting directly the source environment outside of copy command processes. We're also moving data across a private network path. So Doug mentioned the perimeter, where you have a traditional firewall architecture and perimeter set up to protect the customer data. We adhere to that perimeter and basically move the workload data and the customer data exclusively between the path, between the source and the target environment. Typically, that's across like a VPN connection. In private data center consolidation projects, it's usually an extended VLAN or trunked VLANs. In different cloud scenarios, there may be things like direct connect circuits or VPN circuits that allow the data path to be exclusive between the source environment and the target cloud environment. We also do a live copy, and the only data, so to speak, that moves out to Meadow as a service is metadata, or basically data about the operating system instances. So what we do in general is migrate things on scale. So if you look at our architecture, you have the Meadow SAS environment, which is basically built in a public cloud environment. It runs in a highly available fashion and basically serves customer data requests behind their firewall as a web-based service. So architecturally, the inbound and outbound traffic between our SAS environment and a customer environment is bidirectional port 443 or HTTPS. And then all of the other data traffic between the source and target that happens behind the firewall is port 50,000 over IP protocol and various paths that are required to do that inside of the customer environment. So I'll quickly step through how we work. So the first piece is that we deploy what we call a cloud appliance into the target cloud environment. And that's basically a virtual machine that is set up and helps orchestrate the data movement between sources and targets, and also brokers metadata between the source and target environments and our SAS environment. Once the cloud appliance is set up, usually this is a 20 or 30-minute exercise for a one-time configuration. The cloud appliance then is able to receive messages from the web interface in our SAS environment and also communicate between the source and target environments relevant to migrations. So the first step when you go through a migration is that the cloud appliance will collect attributes from the sources. And in this case, you have a three-tier classic multi-tier web app type of application. We're basically gathering metadata about each operating system instance. And metadata in our definition is just a definition of what that OS looks like. The CPU, memory, network identity, disk file system information, the OS type and version, etc. We'll gather that for each of the sources defined, move that to the CA, and then we take that out securely to our SAS environment and model target workers. So for us, a target worker is basically a wireframe operating system that has an ephemeral boot drive that we then push into the target cloud environment. It'll gain a network identity. And for Windows, that's basically a WinPE image that has an ephemeral boot sector. And then for Linux, it's basically a stripped down Ubuntu Linux image that serves as a target and a landing zone for the source operating system to be migrated to. Once you initiate the copy command set, the sources are basically copied, cloned, and migrated from one given source machine to one given target worker machine. And once that's complete, we'll basically customize the target worker. And what that means is we're basically pulling out the old drivers from the source environment and putting in the new drivers that are applicable to the given supported target cloud environment, booting that machine, removing the ephemeral boot sector or drive, and then upon completion of the migration, you basically have a live copy and clone of your source server environment. So a good way to look at our architecture is that you have a one-to-one relationship between a given source and a given target worker. You have a many-to-one relationship between sources and the cloud appliance. And once the migration is complete, the cloud appliance can basically be decommissioned and you have a live copy of the environment running in the target environment. This can be repeated, done in serial, initiated via UI commands through the web interface, or automated through APIs that are basically built into the product for everything that you can do through the GUI. A couple other key features. So one is differential migration. So Doug was mentioning the importance of cutover. We've engineered that element of migration projects into our product. in what we call a differential migration. So that you have a differential migration that is a separate migration event that's run for any given migration for a source to a target. And what that means is basically we're doing a block level differential copy for Windows and a file level differential copy for Linux. That's a event-based migration and typically is run after test and prior to cutover to a production cutover in the target cloud environment. Another key feature are migration extensions, and these are basically run routines on the target worker that can be automated and allow you to basically run code on the target worker or the target machine as needed. So systems management routines, security checks, different things you may want to automate from a cloud automation point of view, all can be called via migration extensions and driven routinely. And this just helps with the general idea of removing hands from the process and basically running infrastructure as code in the migration workstream. So use cases from a business point of view are really varied. We see a lot of data center consolidation, data center exits, projects where customers are consolidating data rooms and data halls or just machines running in strange places into core compute. We see a mix of public cloud entries and exits, and also a lot of customers deciding to go with hybrid models where you have a mix of hosted or public infrastructure running operating system support and private. And we see a lot of churn across the board, some customers moving out, some moving in, but in general, we're placed as a technology to help facilitate the workload migration from place to place and make it less of a science project and more of a repeatable task that generalist IT people can execute. From a technology point of view, a good way to look at what we do is that you can do P2V, P2C, or any V2V type migration project for x86 supported workloads using this technology. Today, the targets are VMware, and as mentioned before, we're adding an addition of Azure, Amazon, and OpenStack targets in the future. In terms of where we fit in the market, functionally, you look at a classic migration project, and you always have disparate tools for operating system data copy, and usually different tools for Linux versus Windows. Also, point tools usually from the vendors for hypervisor upgrades, P2V, et cetera. We're taking all of those core functions that you would see in a classic migration project and consolidating those things into one tool set. What we're not doing is things like Unix migrations or AIX or Solaris or HPUX, or interrogating storage devices or arrays or moving network devices. We typically have all of that out of scope and focus on the workload. And in general, we're seeing a shift in the general market to move the storage and the data back to be directly associated with the workload, basically in contrary to the whole disassociation that happened 15 years ago with the evolution of SAN and NAS devices. Also, we have a lot of indirect competition. So from VMware, there are 3 or 4 very good point tools, often free, that do 1 or 2 use cases and do a fairly good job at those. But rarely are these tools supporting a live migration, and usually they require installing code or agents in the source environment. And it's similar for P2V tools like Placement or host-based application tools like DoubleTake, that the tools are all engineered usually around one use case. They're usually very, very good at those. But when you look at a broader picture of a data center or a cloud migration project, there's a lot of complexity for customers that have to learn and then master multiple tool sets. And what we're doing is basically consolidating all of that into a SaaS-delivered live migration capability and making it more simple to drive migrations to the cloud. So Wyatt, that concludes this section. I'll hand it back to you.
Terrific. Well, I really appreciate the level of specificity on the kind of real mechanics of doing that. A quick question for you before we turn it over to Greg. So do the customer's data get stored in the River Meadow SAS environment?
So the customer data stays on premises or within the customer network. So the only data that we're taking out is metadata about the sources. but the customer data does not traverse out to our SAS environment.
Got it. So that's helpful to know. And also, when you're dealing with database and transactional system migrations, are there any additional considerations when you've got sort of, it's one thing to kind of move a collection of data, but when it's a bit more of a transactional system, is there an extra dynamic or consideration that one needs to take into account?
Yeah, there certainly is, and a lot of this goes back to traditional best practices for database migrations and data movement of volatile data structures. So in the SLED SMB marketplace, you definitely see a lot of legacy tools and database environments that maybe haven't been touched in, let's say, a very long time. We generally advise that a lot of caution is taken with those types of environments to especially quiesce them before cutover, or use things like log shipping or log rollbacks as an added layer of protection and data protection to the migration event. And what we're doing as a technology is basically just shipping the binary information for an operating system, but we're not interrogating the databases or the applications to control whether or not they're running during the time of migration. So great question, and extra care is advised in those types of migration environments.
I'm sure. Well, I want to turn it over now to Greg Herbold. Greg, so you get to see kind of a grandstand view of a lot of operations at the state and education market level. What did you hear today that stuck out to you, and what additional lessons might you share?
Well, thanks, Wyatt. Appreciate that. We in our practice at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, we do see, a broad landscape of different scenarios. To that end, Wyatt, also, I brought a friend along today. So Bob Shar, who I know has been part of some of your webcasts in the past.
Oh, yeah. Welcome, Bob.
That don't know Bob, he is our technology specialist and really our solutions leader for state and local government and education customers. And, the frame, and, you see I put a slide up that shows kind of 5 steps. A couple of themes jump out, really, from Doug's story, right, the need for process, right, and one of my key takeaways from listening to Doug is, just around the notion of these aren't always technology projects. Sometimes these are operational and business processes and business projects. And we see a lot of that, right, and for us, right, what we try to focus on is the need for flexibility. Because as you saw in the great details that John was able to share about, just how workloads can be moved from place to place, and, all the different sensitivities around, the security and the automation and making sure that the workload can remain in an online status, even while migration work is taking place. All of those things to us, demand a lot of flexibility, because sometimes you want to do something very small, right? It might be that you just made a purchase of a new either technology service or technology equipment, and you want to get the workload to move to it. But sometimes it's full blown, and we try to, we hear a lot of voices kind of around these 5 themes. The first is really discovery, right? And we hear a lot, from governments in particular, certainly from schools, around, that there's multi-platform infrastructures that are getting dated, that are complex or overly complex, that they're expensive. Sometimes it's, John mentioned the idea of a digital landfill, right? That there's, technology that's perhaps out there that's been, deployed that isn't being used anymore. We heard Doug mention that as well in terms of things that maybe haven't been decommissioned. But sometimes step 1 is not to think about how do I get to the cloud, right? Sometimes step 1 is discovery about what do I have, right? What's the complete view of IT, right? What's the foundation that I have, and that might lead to migration decisions to come. But it's a more precedent question that needs to be answered first, and that takes an array of services that are needed to do that, right? The next phase, if you kind of spin around the wheel here from there, it goes into looking at things like suitability, right, and doing an analysis to understand what are the workloads that are still supporting the mission, that are meeting shared services requirements, that have extra concerns or make me stay up at night thinking about security or privacy of citizen data or student data or PHI. All of these things lead to the need for making selections about where am I just focused on lowering costs, right? Where am I willing to absorb migration costs because the sensitivity of the data is so significant, and how can my future cost benefits analysis be defined? So all of that suitability work really represents a second area where we see people putting a lot of attention. The third layer we see is about when the conversation starts to embrace the cloud. And usually that's, the stimulus behind that is often financial, right? It's about operational costs, and it's about streamlining, resources, so that in the case of state governments, for example, right, reinvesting in citizen services, right? In the case of education, it's about making sure that IT, right, gets locked down on the foundational items, right, so that they can focus on helping the curriculum side, or the faculty, or the research groups, or the medical center, achieve, objectives that help students and patients. So, across the board, cloud certainly represents a lot of promise there. But as we heard, particularly from Doug, sometimes it's about coming back, right? It's about workloads that maybe went out there where the decision is made later that maybe public cloud is not the place for some things. And so we see that direction moving here too. But again, this phase here is when we see a lot of our customers going through and trying to map those workloads which are best suited for the cloud, and which, because of their risk profile, it's decided to kind of keep those on premises or in a more secure position relative to others. But that mapping exercise of deciding what goes where, essentially, is a key piece. With those three things done, right, then migration, really steps to the forefront, right? And what we try to focus on is, in our practice anyway, is about to as much as an extent as possible, having an any-to-any kind of position from source to target. You saw that echoed, and it's why we are such good partners with Meadow and John, right? But it's also about pay-as-you-go, right? We like to think about things like, we call it attach, right? When someone buys either physical or cloud services, we want them to think about what should you attach to that to make sure that you're effective with that IT purchase that you make. And that might be education that can go with that. That might be installation, so that the equipment doesn't sit on the dock. It actually makes it into the data center, gets plugged in, gets utilized. And workload migration can be part of that just routine deployment and IT health array of services. But it can also be part of this big full-blown mix, right? And then the fifth step is when you drive into the actual cloud enablement. And, this can be thought of as governance. This could be thought of as sort of routine maintenance. This can be thought of as, continuous evaluation, based on new information about, does the sensitivity profile around a certain set of data change? Are there compliance requirements that have now come into the fold that need to be considered, right? But across the board, this is where, kind of where our customers are looking to sort of lock in, right, those high availability, those scalable interoperability and adaptability goals that they have, and also those cost savings, and routinize those and make sure that those become part of SLAs, and making sure that they're measuring, how this new technology deployment actually achieves the business goals that led to those decisions back in some of the earlier phases. So that's, I guess if we can encapsulate it in one busy slide, that's what we're seeing is across the board, workload migration fits as one of a few steps. Not unlike what Doug showed at the beginning about the plan, design, deploy phases that Purdue goes through. So Bob, I know I asked you to join today, and I know that you have a much deeper technical perspective around a lot of these business movements that we see customers going through. What would you add to this mix, relative to the topic of workload migration?
Well, your descriptions here are spot on, and I could really kind of step back and look at a few different scenarios here. One is where we see this take place and what you presented is more or less from an IT strategy for migration's point of view, right? Because if you're looking holistically as IT would, and you're trying to implement a migration strategy from a public cloud provider, for instance, because maybe some departments have strayed and gone there, but maybe started leveraging some APIs that live there. Now, there's the worry, and the concern is we don't really understand that environment enough to want to just pull the trigger or feel that comfortable with it. So, that's one use case, and that kind of takes you full circle to your number 5 here. And when you look at cloud enablement, for instance, it's really about a hybrid cloud strategy, right? So the second use case that we see more and more is very departmental focused, because a lot of departments have kind of gone around, and we're seeing this taking on a new trend here. Departments are just swiping their cards, going directly in the cloud. And they're finding vehicles to get there. They bypass IT because they have a need right now and they can't wait. So now that they've gone there, their costs might have changed. You know, the cost model's gone up. Maybe they started paying thousands or tens of thousands a month. It might have gone up now to hundreds of thousands, and they're going, whoa, you know, we need some cost containment here. We need to relook at our options, and let's take a look at moving things back. So, you know, that's the second scenario. And then the last one, again, really kind of comes back to, you know, the new trends that's really taking place and taking shape today is really around a software-defined data center and the layers of abstraction taking place inside the data center. So I'm virtualizing my switch fabric. I'm virtualizing my storage. I've already virtualized my servers and to some extent my workstations, but now I'm virtualizing backups. I'm reducing dependency on all this proprietary hardware, and I want that level of portability, agility, and automation in the data center. And so with that comes a hybrid cloud strategy. So again, that's the bigger picture. I don't want to boil the ocean and just scare everybody away by saying this is the only way to do this, because there's many use cases also that our customers have where they might just have a few things running there. Heck, it could be 100 web servers sitting out there in the cloud that they don't need there. They could completely move them back. They already know what they got to do. Matter of fact, they might already know what the new home looks like and might already own the asset. And in that use case scenario, we can help the customer pull the trigger and make that happen rather quickly. So I don't want to scare customers off with saying it has to be this great big grand assessment, but at the same time, for the CIOs who are rather concerned and the CTOs that are concerned with mission critical environments and that may not know the end-to-end intricacies of what lives out there, we can help in all the scenarios.
That's great. Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate that. So just looking at the clock, I know we've got a few questions that have come into the Q&A window, and Wyatt, I want to get back to that very quickly. But if I may, real quick before we jump into the Q&A, on behalf of our friends at Intel, who also, along with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, have sponsored the session today. We appreciate everyone joining, and certainly, the important voices that Doug and John brought to the conversation as well today. There is a link that's provided here to get you access to a solution brief where you can hear at least some of the perspective that Hewlett-Packard Enterprise has on the topic, certainly informed by some of the things you heard from John today from River Meadow, but it's available to you as an asset for you and your organizations to use. So again, on behalf of Intel, thanks, Wyatt, for the chance to do this. And maybe from there, Wyatt, I'll hand it back to you, and we'll dig into some of these good questions I've seen come in.
Terrific. So, yes, I invite our audience to use your chat function to submit some questions. We have one here, and I've got a couple as well. We have one question regarding the exit strategy, and specifically, what type of exit support do you provide? I guess I'll throw that open to John and maybe Greg. And what do you do to prepare for a pre-migration for an exit? Let me throw that open maybe to maybe Greg and Bob first, but I'd like to hear as well from John on that. What do you do in that circumstance?
Yeah, Bob, I think you'd be perfect to jump in on that. I know you've talked on that a couple of different times, but I don't want you to feel pressure to jump in front of John. But Bob, what are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, I missed that part of it. What was that?
No problem. Yeah, so, I think, to Doug's earlier question, you always need to prepare for an exit. So you've moved, and Bob, I know you spoke about kind of the holistic approach, but specifically when it comes time for an exit, you're moving out of a cloud. Is there something additional, and is there additional support for something like that?
Yes, absolutely. So for us in SLED, the key dependency is a VMware environment. And, we have a end-to-end stack that it can help solve that pain point, and would encourage the customers to reach out to HP, reach out to the folks here, the contacts on this call, so we could help, right? Because at the end of the day, what customers are looking for are to get rid of multiple point solutions and complexities with an end-to-end stack. And today, HP is the only manufacturer that I'm aware of that still owns all the hardware components and software components with that native look, feel, integration all the way in to the vSphere stack, including vRealize with all our management tools. So administrators don't have to leave their native look and feel and administration windows that they deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Great.
So in a nutshell, yes, they need that end target. That end target has to be a vSphere environment, and we even have hybrid cloud reference configurations and architectures that can help promote that perfect end state for these customers.
And John, any additional thoughts about preparing for a pre-migration phase of an exit?
Yeah, just to add to Bob's comments. So one of the bigger challenges, I mean, you'd think that moving into the cloud, you'd have an easy view of what's happening, but a lot of customers lose track of what's out there and then have to go discover and re-inventory. So maintaining a current view of inventory and reconciliation of what's out there running is painstaking work, but highly valuable for the exit scenario questions here.
Appreciate that. So, Doug, I'd like to pull you back in on this, and we've had a couple of questions from our audience regarding, planning for workloads. And so one of our audience wants to know, can these approaches and solutions move workloads in parallel? Like, what, for example, if you've got hundreds of virtual machines or workloads at a time, can you process them in parallel, or do you take a different approach?
So from our perspective, the angle that I take on this from the workload perspective is being in the application space. I look at it more from the perspective of a coupled sort of business process, I guess I would say. So most of the time, the kinds of things that we're moving, especially in the case I'm talking about here with sort of public shared instance, we are not moving many workloads. We do bundle some of those workloads, and they get moved together. But it is not, basically the way we're going at it, we're not going after like a data center migration or consolidation kind of move. This is a different sort of discussion. But I know that we have in other spaces, we have done those kinds of things. I know that we have closed down. We're going through a massive data center consolidation, I guess, as everybody is. We have everything from broom closets to full-blown data centers on campus, and we've gone through a process of pulling those together. And in those cases, we're moving large numbers of workloads simultaneously. I would suggest we use a slightly different methodology there, because it doesn't start from the application or the business process perspective. It starts more from the technology end and then an inventory of what's sitting on that platform. But it's similar. I mean, there's similar sort of processes that we go through.
So it sounds like this is a good solution if you're in the process of consolidating multiple data centers down to, let's say, one.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Yeah.
And just add in on the...
Yes, please.
Just to add into that question on the technology front. So we are able to run lots and lots of migrations in parallel from a River Meadow perspective. The traditional bottleneck, however, is going to be your network. So the bandwidth and latency, especially the bandwidth point to point between the source and target environments, is usually a limiting factor. But also, as Doug was describing, the move group definitions and the application interdependencies earlier, those are also factors that go into how big of an actual move group is going to be for a given migration event.
Right. and maybe a similar question, can we use this approach to consolidate from multiple hypervisors to one single platform, such as a larger converged solution like I know there's a CS 700XL version of that. Does that work equally well, moving multiple hypervisors to a single platform?
Yes, yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, our dependency is on making sure that it's running vSphere or vCloud in that target environment, but we're basically able to move out of it and consolidate from multiple source hypervisor environments. That's no problem at all.
Yeah. Any additional experience or thoughts on that one, Doug?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, the movement that we've done on campus, we've done in the data center consolidation piece. For us, most of the time, this sizing issue or running large amounts of data in parallel has not been such a large issue, and our environment is pretty standardized. We don't have a lot of variant across the different data centers in technology, so it's not quite as complicated as some of these environments. So we've been able to do a lot of that movement. I guess I would call it somewhat seamlessly.
Okay. And I got another question relating to exit support, and I guess we were hoping for a little more elaboration. What type of exit support do you provide, and can you elaborate a little further on that? Greg, maybe Greg or John, or rather Bob, maybe you can take that one.
So I guess it depends on what you're speaking to in terms of an exit support strategy. So just bear in mind this, when we do a migration using this solution, nothing is installed preloaded in that source environment. It's completely untouched. So how that works is the River Meadow technology can talk natively through the AWS or public cloud API calls so that everything is coming through a native look and feel from that backbone architecture. So we completely come in a stealth mode to extract everything from the metadata and all that data in a point-to-point secure connection behind a customer firewall. So what happens and how it traditionally works is an instance gets replicated or created behind a customer firewall. At some point, the customer will actually need to test it. So they could do this while that whole environment remains live and untouched and untainted with zero performance impact where it lives currently. And until the customer feels comfortable, they're not going to flip a switch or flip a bit and turn that other environment off. They're going to have the 100% risk-free guarantee that everything is completely there and intact. Nothing is decommissioned. The source environment will always be there until the customer decides to turn it off. If the customer is happy with the look and feel and all the content, then at that point, there's something called a diff sync that's available in River Meadow that will just basically take the change data sets and replicate only the change data to that new environment, and then the customer can use their change control processes to flip that switch. Does that make sense?
I think so, and I hope it does for our questioner on that one. Unfortunately, I'm afraid we've come up on the end of our hour, and I'm going to have to leave it there. But really appreciated all the information that you shared today. Doug Foster, John Merriman, Greg Herbold, and Bob Shar. I really appreciate the sort of specific recommendations and experiences that you shared today. So thanks very much for all that work. I also want to thank our audience for tuning in today to StateScoop's and EdScoop's Government and Education Technology webinar series. And, of course, I'd like to extend a special acknowledgement and thanks to Hewlett-Packard Enterprises and Intel for underwriting today's program. Just a reminder, you can download a copy of today's entire slide presentation from the resource list And again, I'd encourage you, if you have colleagues that would benefit from the sort of details we learned today about migrating workloads to the cloud, please consider sharing the link that you received with your registration confirmation email. It's free, and they'll have up to 90 days to view the archived edition. So look for more of our coverage on cloud migrations and other tools and tips on StateScoop.com and EdScoop.com. We appreciate it. And on behalf of all of us here, this is your host, Wyatt Cash. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.